Good morning, everybody. Let's open this morning's class with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this day that we have. And we just pray that this morning's class will be of benefit to those who are listening. Thank you for your word and your love for us. And it's in Jesus' name we pray.
We're continuing the study on Deborah now, and we'll finish Deborah up this morning. Then we'll jump right into New Testament. Jeff's going to switch over on that, and then we'll continue. One of the things that I will note, I just mentioned to Jeff, but I haven't announced it. We do have on YouTube a channel, Melrose Church of Christ channel, which these videos that are linked from the website are actually on. So if you go to YouTube and search for Melrose Church of Christ, you'll see a channel, and that'll have all of these videos there also, along with other things we may throw up, like for Ganderbrook and other activities there, so you're welcome to check that out. All right, Judges in Deborah. We read chapters 4 and 5 last week. You probably want to open up to that so we can use it as a reference for part of this discussion. As far as our notes so far, we've established from the beginning that Deborah was called a prophetess. She speaks for God. She has wisdom and discernment from God, issues judgment essentially, and God is speaking through or to her, which we see in 4:6 and in other places. We see her role as being a mediator, an advisor, a judge, but however you describe it, she is influential to the people of Israel at the time. So let's pick up with some of the verses which, I guess as we were closing last week, we talked about in verse 4:6 that even amidst this, God particularly called Barak to lead the people into battle and to be effective leader there. And kind of the question we were leaving on was, well, why didn't God have Deborah go out there? Some of the responses was, well, it'd be kind of odd having a woman go out there and lead a battle because it's just not quite right. But that's kind of where we left off. So from there, let's go to chapter 4. Let's just read the first part of that again. Verses 6 through 8. It says, Now she sent and summoned Barak the son of Abinoam from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. And I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, and with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. Then Barak said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, then I will not go. Well, what's Barak essentially doing here?
He's doubting.
Doubting, absolutely. There's a faith issue, clearly. In terms of his role, what is God calling him to be in his role here?
Calling him to be a leader, he's choosing not to.
Exactly. He's calling him to be a leader of Israel, to go out and lead the people into the battle, and he's afraid to be a leader. He's like, I'm not going to be a leader. Only if you go with me. So he's abdicating his responsibility of being a leader and saying only if Deborah, definitely the judgment leader of sorts, only if you go with me will I go out there. Other comments?
If you follow on later, Gideon had some of the same problems too, and had to test God with it. So we understand that this was a time where people, the way of faith was hard to find, and God was calling it from.
Sure. We actually, all through the Judges, you see these elements of I don't know if this is real or not. I don't know if these instructions are, am I really being called by God, or is this some, something I ate for dinner is not telling me the right communication? Just confusion, essentially. And there are countless times where they come forward and ask for something to substantiate it. Now here it's more just as doubt. If you go with me, fine, I'll go. But if you're just trying to send me out so I'll get killed, I'm not doing it. More directed to Deborah. But he is willing to go with Deborah, which would say that he would believe it would be from God if Deborah was willing to put her life on the line and go with it. Similarly with Gideon, give me something miraculous proof here. Jephthah, he's a little on the outside. I'll give you tribute if you do this. But you get a little of this just not a walk of faith, but more uncertainty. So let's go to, what was the response for Barak, for Barak saying to Deborah, I'm not going to go out unless you go with me. He's basically abdicated his responsibility. What was essentially the punishment for that?
The woman would get glory.
Why is that a punishment?
Big man's ego.
Hurts the man's ego. I'm sure that's true. Any other thoughts?
I think God was giving glory where glory belonged. The woman was the leader, God gave honor to her.
So who was the woman that received the glory for bringing down the army of Sisera? Jael, yeah. Oh, what did she do? Andrew.
Killed the commander, Sisera.
Killed Sisera. That was her role. Now, how many people died that day? Actually, I don't even recall off the top of my head. It was many thousand. Let's see if it... I'm not seeing it. I know that they took 10,000 men out, and I think the battle they were fighting was much larger than that. He had 900 iron chariots as part of his use to oppress them.
It says all the troops of Sisera fell by the sword, not a man was left.
So we don't know exactly, but we're talking many thousand people. And who killed them all? Almost all. Barak and the men, the 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun. Yet who gets credit for destroying the army who only killed one person? Jael. Why is that?
Killed the leader.
Clearly a leader is critical for organization. However, at this point, everyone's dead except for the leader. Who's he leading? His battle, his leadership is lost. But true, she brought down the leader, therefore she gets credit. But why does she get credit? It's part of the punishment for Barak, essentially. But what do you think?
It was because he had asked Deborah to come along, and then God arranged, well, okay, since your faith isn't enough, you have to ask Deborah to come along, I'm going to see you over to other houses.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I always, when I was referred by the story, I always thought Deborah was the one who got credit for it. Granted, then when I got a little bit older, I read back and actually read the text and went, oh, that's not right. Actually, it was Jael. But yes, this is part of that punishment. Yes, Dave.
You also see that he went down hiding himself. He didn't go down fighting. So he's embarrassed more because he's taken down by a woman. So it's a put down on both sides, the leadership and his leadership.
Sure, so Sisera himself
Yeah.
had the embarrassment of running away from battle, absconding from his responsibility, and then being killed by a woman while he was sleeping, which is definitely a scar in the biblical time frame. Yes.
I mean, it doesn't actually say this here, but I think there is a principle that God can use anybody. I don't know who Jael, wife of Haber the Kenite, was, but, you know, God said, hey, I can use her just as well as I can use this high leader to accomplish his purposes. That's another lesson maybe all in itself, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point too with, we talked about this in our class with dealing with the armies, with even Israel. God uses Israel. I think was this part on last Sunday? We've talked about this congregation recently, but that God looked at Israel and said, I'm taking these people over for you, but not because you're so great, not because you're anything. I made a promise to your forefather, and I'm taking care of you, but it's not because of your goodness. It's not because of how great you are. I'm simply fulfilling something, and I'm using you in this process. And we get many examples in scriptures of that, where God has raised up someone in particular and used them for a particular purpose. Sometimes they're willing, like Esther. Sometimes they're not willing, like Nebuchadnezzar, or Pharaoh, or others that shift and change in their relationship. But yeah, I think it's a valid, good point. Other thoughts? All right, so if we move on, chapter 5. At this point, Deborah and Barak sing a song which describes a lot of what happened and how things came about. Well, what can we glean from this that helps us understand their roles in Israel?
It's kind of like watching TV. You know what's going on because you saw it on the news. In the old day, you would have a song, and everybody would sing, and they would sing it again and again and again and again, and that's the way the information got passed from generation to generation, time to time.
Good way of describing it. And what do we learn from this snippet? What does it tell us about, particularly remember the framework for our discussion here. We're looking at God's design for men and women and what he intends, what in this particular, these framework questions for Deborah are, is Deborah in a role that God intends for general women to be in? Is she fulfilling God's design, or is she working against God's design? Is the role she's playing an example for all women, or example for a bad example for women? These are the type of questions we're trying to ask. So, what can we learn from this? So, looking at her role, what do we learn, and how does this song share about that?
Right at the beginning of 5, it says that she takes the lead. Now, it's not our responsibility to take the lead every time, but there might be a time that, like, say, I would have to take the lead in something. But it says that she takes the lead.
So, what's your verse? So we're all together on it.
At the very beginning, it says, when the princes of Israel take the lead, then the people will willingly offer themselves praise the Lord.
And so who are the princes of Israel? Actually describes it a little bit later in the passage. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I don't think this is a violation of God's will personally, because she's described as a mother. And then later, so verse 7, it says, village life in Israel ceased until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. When they chose new gods, war came to the city gates, and not a shield or spear was seen. So this is a mother observing what's happening to the family. But then it says, my heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people. So she's not counting herself amongst the princes. She's a concerned person. And, through God's power, she offers wisdom. She doesn't want to lead the army, and she doesn't still. I guess Barak kind of wanted her as an advisor because he didn't really believe what she told him. but yeah, she's somebody who's pointing out the wrongs and encouraging people to do the right thing.
Exactly. So she's seeing her role as a mother, and she describes the princess as those volunteers that are leading. They're stepping forward, that should be stepping forward, that haven't been stepping forward, but they're called to step forward and do step forward in this battle in some limited amount. Yes, Becky?
I just want to note that whenever they actually mention women in the Bible, they usually say the wife of, when they like hear Deborah, it says Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapdoth. Or they don't say Deborah the prophetess, they say the wife of Lapdoth, and Jael, the wife of, whatever his name is. Yeah, he did.
Okay. There, any understanding of why they do that? I think we may have mentioned it once before.
Because I think it's because men are more acknowledged back then, and so they.
For a particular reason,
You
though.
would know them.
They-
You could get a better understanding of the women if you knew who the man was too.
It's more placement.
Is it because you could tell what tribe they were from?
There we go. It's getting closer here. The genealogy is kind of the core of the Israelite religion. God says, all these promises God has given about coming a Messiah are built into the lineage. You, a son of David. Through Abraham, all nations will be blessed. Through Isaac, all nations will be blessed. Through Jacob, all nations will be blessed. Through David, you will never cease to have a descendant on the throne, which is fulfilled in Jesus. So all of these genealogies are critical. So people had to keep track of their genealogy, and if they couldn't, they were not part of the direct fellowship. For example, a Levite, a priest, couldn't be a priest unless they could prove that they were part of the Aaron's line. So you had to have this line. Those lines were taken by the lineage of the men. Now granted, there are exceptions, but there are always exceptions, and they're usually added on, which is why if you want to know who Deborah is, and you're looking in the lineage, you're not going to read down the lineage and see Deborah. You're going to read down the lineage and see her husband. And then you say, if you say, here is your husband, that now gives you a placement. So if you're reading through genealogy trying to find out where does Deborah fit in, now you go down and say, oh, here is her connection. She's right here. This is where she helped lead and work through this role of hers. So I think that's probably at least that's my opinion of what the most salient point of saying the wife of is that it connects it to the genealogy, which puts it in context. I can agree or disagree, though. That's my thoughts.
And it is kind of interesting going back to Proverbs 31, which we looked at, where, the wife is described as someone who is very supportive of her husband and provides a lot of things and brings him good and not harm. And, Deborah, in this particular role, she's kind of doing that, except that Israel is the family.
Mm-hmm.
And she's looking out for them.
Mm-hmm. Agree. Look at verse 12. So now, as we said before, we're looking at the roles that they describe in here. So this is Deborah and Barak singing. And they're describing their roles. And Deborah describes herself as a mother in Israel. Back in verse 7, I think. And moves on to 12. How does she describe, and how does he describe their two roles?
Deborah was trying to get them to be aware of what was going on. Wake up, wake up. And Barak is the one that's to take captives.
So you see some of their function. I mean, she's awake, sing a song, and the mother of Israel essentially saying, "Hey, this is what we're supposed to do. Let's do it." And Barak in particular is to lead the captives, to go out to war, to bring them back to take care of this responsibility. So we see a little bit of color in there. How much we can read into that, I don't know. If anything else you'd like to add out of this passage? Any other insights you get into their characters and roles?
Well, coming back to what you were saying earlier about JL, there's quite an honorarium given to her, starting in verse 24. The details of the whole story are presented there. Nothing is said about Barak at all in that context, nothing at all.
Yep. It's kind of interesting, when you look at the celebration of the event, the snippet, how many words are given to Barak? 3. How many were given to Deborah? 6 or 7. How many were given to Jael? She's got multiple verses. Yeah. And so it puts in perspective what is noted, and that's a fulfillment of that prophecy that says, this credit's going to a woman because you're not going to stand up and do what I asked you to do.
Yeah, I think there's something else in the song that hit me when I read it last week when we were reading it again, is the impression of the loss of somebody dying at the end. You see, my son's died there, and I'm expecting him back, and he doesn't come back. And the loneliness, I feel that more in the reading of it now than I ever have. I don't know. It's just, at the end, it said, you're looking for him to come home, at the last few verses. You're looking for him to come, and he doesn't come because he's been killed. You get the other
Verse
side.
28 referring to?
Sister's mother.
The mother's, looking for it. And this is about women, so it kind of hit me differently because we're looking at women's roles rather than, when I look at Judges, and I'm thinking down the pathway. But here's the hurt of war.
The other side of war, sure.
Because, I lost a good friend in high school who went off to the war. And, you suffer it on this side. But war has always been here, and there's always been that loss.
But now, I will say about that, I don't think the song is saying,
No.
poor sister's mom, she's
No.
not going to have any son coming home.
No.
It's more
Victory.
a victory.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
saying, look, see, this is, it's more,
But you got to see the other to see
they're
that.
praising the killer of her son,
Oh, well.
and saying now she has no one coming home because she's looking out the window and we've taken the trophy. There's a little bit of this, not quite taunting, but definitely poetic explanation. Any other comments on Deborah? Because we are moving on to the New Testament next, so last chance to get in another comment. All right, Jeff. By the way, did everyone get a handout for today? Did anyone not? I'll have my son run back and hand them out. All right, there's a few hands. Andrew, if you want to run back and just hand out whoever's got their hand up, pass it along.
Yeah, sure. So before we get into the specific passages in the New Testament that talk about gender roles, we thought it would be a good idea to sort of provide a little bit of a backdrop for this in terms of the transition that goes on between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And so the first several verses that are listed there in your handout are the ones that are pertinent to this idea. I think it's worth just reading through these. They're not very long, and we've talked about some of them before in past classes, but it might be a good idea just to remind us some of these things. So I'm going to be looking for volunteers to read these verses in turn. So first of all, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Somebody'd like to read that? Myron?
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Okay. So at the very beginning, humankind was created both created in the image of God, male and female. Then let's flip over to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 22, in verse 30. Somebody'd like to read that.
At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven.
Okay. And then Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 through 29. Anybody got that? Go ahead.
For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise.
Okay. So the promises for everybody, male and female, Jew and Gentile, and so on. And now let's go back to the Old Testament for a second. One of the key verses that talks about the promise of the new covenant is in Jeremiah chapter 31. Somebody could read Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. Go ahead, Andrew.
Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I will make to the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach again, each man his neighbor, and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin they will remember no more.
Okay. And then finally, one last passage is Acts chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. Go ahead.
In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy.
Okay. So just sort of a general question I'd like us to think about just for a little bit. So this collection of verses, they all relate to the promise of the future, of what's going to happen, when there's the new heaven and the new earth, after the judgment, the resurrection of the dead. So this is off in the future, all these things. And I guess the question I'd like us to think about a little bit, or at least keep it in the back of our mind, is how should this backdrop influence our thinking when we study the gender roles? Take a couple of thoughts now, and I think as we go on, we'll probably maybe have some other ideas.
Well, we're told that God looks at the heart.
Okay? Roberta?
Well, maybe like when you look at the roles of the body, and the people have different talents and different roles and different abilities, but it's all the same in God's eyes.
Okay.
One part of the body isn't more important than the other, and then the gender roles, that would also apply.
Okay. Anybody else? I don't want to belabor this too much because we could get very philosophical here. But I guess bottom line is, male or female, Jew or Gentile, whatever, we are all ultimately unified and heading toward the same else is the same for everyone. In the meantime, we have different roles, but our roles do not all reflect on the hope that we have. We all have the same hope in Christ. So we can come back to this a little bit more if you want. But for now, let's go to our first New Testament passage, which actually specifically addresses, in the New Testament context, the roles of men and women. And this is in 1 Peter. Now, this is a fairly long reading, and I'm thinking, Chris, maybe we should break this up in pieces, or do you think we should read the whole thing?
I think getting the chapter 2 portion is probably a good starting point, because especially if Rick and I are going to be able to finish the whole.
Okay.
Maybe even do the first section of chapter 2.
Okay, so let me get out.
Maybe read the whole thing next week.
Yeah, I had made some notes on how to break this up. Let's give me a second to pull these out.
Through.
I have them here. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, if somebody could read the first chunk, which is 1 Peter 2, verses 9 through 12. Somebody like to read that for us?
But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are a people of God. Once you had not received mercies, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us.
Okay. So what are a few key points relevant to our study that you might pull out of these verses? He hasn't started to talk about gender roles yet here, but he is kind of setting the stage, sort of the larger context. So what are some key points here? Go ahead, Joe.
The royal priesthood, and he's talking about both men and women. He's talking about royal priesthood. And it's future, but you are a royal priesthood.
Yeah, that's right. So what's the, oh, I'm sorry, June, go ahead.
That's right, and it says after that, they're a chosen people, and it says we're people belonging to God, so it classifies both men and women. We're all people of God.
Yeah. And what is the purpose of this priesthood?
Declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light.
Right. Right. So it is a priesthood, all the Christians together, both men and women, and it does have one grand purpose, which is to glorify God on the day he visits us. And it says, with your good deeds. Now, remember Proverbs 31, speaking particularly of the women, the good deeds were one of the things they were remembered for, right? That was, they were known for their good deeds, not only to their own families, but through what they did, it actually blessed the whole community. So there is a continuing thread here. The idea that the people who love God are supposed to glorify God with their lives, that has not changed. But we are now called, the whole group of us is now called the royal priesthood, as opposed to, the Levites and the sons of Aaron. That's a change. That's a new thing. And again, that harkens back to the passage we looked at in Jeremiah 31, the new covenant. So any other observations you'd like to make on this section before we move on? Yes, Myron.
The first part, that we're chosen, that it's God's action that's selecting us.
Yes. This is God's will. This is God's plan. This is not something that was, invented by the early church fathers or something. This was God's idea. Let's see, what time is it? I guess we have time to read the next piece. 1 Peter 2, now verses 13 to 25. Might not be able to finish discussing this morning, but at least we can read it. 13 to 25. 1 Peter 2, would like to read that for us. Go ahead.
Submit yourselves to the Lord's sake for every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors, who are sent to him by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only with those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good, and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to them who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep gone astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls.
Okay. So how is submission described in this passage?
We're led by the example of Jesus before us. Jesus did this. It didn't matter that he was accused wrongly. He went ahead and offered himself to obey the Lord
Okay.
and the Father.
Okay. So that is very interesting. Certainly in the I guess you'd call it typical human view, submission is something for lower class, lower caste, inferior people. Well, Jesus Christ is not a lower caste, inferior person, and yet he is described here as having this quality. That's part of the otherworldly aspect of Jesus Christ, is that he is the King of Kings, but he, in some very good ways, is very unlike a lot of earthly kings. Let me ask you a kind of a leading question here. Is submission an active or a passive role in this passage? It's active, isn't it? In fact, it doesn't say, let people make you into a slave, although you may not have much choice if you're a slave, but that's not the way it's worded. It says submit yourselves, and then it says for the Lord's sake. Again, that's very different from, maybe a more worldly way of looking at it. Let somebody else beat up on you because you don't have any choice, and, watch out for your own survival. That's not at all the slant here.
It's actually, he explicitly says the opposite. He says, live as free men, yet honor your brother. In verse 16 and 17.
Very interesting. So it's an attitude, and it is not something that we need to be ashamed of. There's nothing inferior here about what's being described, because it is an active role and it has a purpose. What's the purpose?
I feel like it would have been important for them because there were a lot of people accusing Christians of having king other than Caesar, and that by submitting to the governor, or the king, that they're really showing this to be false, and they're making people who accuse, people who are attacking the church look foolish, and that they're also just showing that Christians are righteous.
Good insight. good inside. What other purposes would this have?
It's God's will.
It's God's will. That's true. God is a God of disorder and of peace. Or it is not a God of disorder, but of peace. Yeah, verse 15, for it is in God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. So this is maybe part of the persecution you were talking about. Good point. Could very well be referring to that. And it's true in general.
You know, we have to look at our world. In our world, if you don't like it, we'll overcome. We'll compete with each other. We're compete-oriented people. We like to, I'll do better, I'll do better, which is good to lift up the right thing, but when that becomes who you are, rather than, you know, winning, it becomes more important than doing the right thing. And and I think that's what Peter's asking. See what you're doing for the right reason. And you have to humble yourself to do it. To follow the Lord, you have to humble yourself again and again and again.
Something I might add here, there's a, when you think about the people you know that are humble versus the ones that are prideful, one particular opposite, they give off a different vibe. I just recently, when my wife had complications with her miscarriage, we took her to the hospital, and the person that was dealing with her, both my wife and I were like, we don't like this guy. We want to disagree with him just because of him. Even though we followed his advice because we felt it was the right advice, we were biting our tongues not to respond, just say negative because we didn't like him. And that spirit that he gave off was this very prideful, I'm going to manipulate this to make you do what I want. And we run into people like that, and you get this negative feeling, this frustration, and it's very repelling. And I think as people of God, we're supposed to be quite the opposite. We're supposed to be a breath of the Spirit of God, of that beauty, of that freshness, of that truth. Now, granted, that will repel some, but the average person will be drawn to that. And I think that's a little of this spirit that we're going after, that Jesus, who could have came and says, I'm the Son of God, you'll do what I tell you to do, didn't do that. He pointed up to God. And I think we have to be similarly actively allow our rights to be taken for the honor of God, but clearly for his sake, not because we're scared or other reasons, but we have to give off that spirit of humility that God example for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's brought out very clearly in verses 16, which we talked about, live as free men. And then following verse 17, he says at the end of verse 16, live as servants of God. If you've read about people who have survived concentration camps and this sort of thing, I don't know how much of that literature you've read, but very often survival depends on maintaining your identity and knowing who you are, regardless of what is being done to you. And this passage does have that flavor to it. Whatever position you're in, remember you're ultimately a servant of God. You may have the position on earth of being a servant of such and such a person or having such and such a role, but ultimately you belong to God. And there's a great deal of strength, personal strength, in having an identity like that, which doesn't depend on your circumstances. And the natural thing for us people is to regard ourselves on the basis of our circumstances, our accomplishments, our wealth, our health, whatever else it is that's going on at the time. But if we allow our identity to be driven by our circumstances, we're going to be all over the map because life isn't predictable. It isn't always good. So any other thoughts? I think we're probably...
Can you explain 18?
8, can I explain what?
18.
Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Well, let me explain in terms of my own experience. I'm not a slave in the the sense of, somebody has a chain on me, that I have worked for companies all my life, where I've had bosses, some of whom I have not agreed with, others of whom have been very kind, some of whom have taken advantage of me, and I still have a job after 30 years. And, I'm not going to say that I've always been an ideal employee or an ideal Christian, but this is good advice. I have found that with bosses that are not very understanding, I've managed to get along with them, and others who have not been submissive or understanding have gotten the boot or have gotten put somewhere else. So I see this as wisdom. Now, the fact that Peter seems to be endorsing slavery here, there's different kinds of slavery. I don't want to get into all that. There are some verses in Paul and verses in the Old Testament, I think, that will teach us that slavery is not God's way. But when it's here, how do you deal with it?
The actual word is true as servants also, which is, it can be translated slaves, can be translated servants, but it probably has somewhat of a indentured servitude type of view.
Slavery was a fact of life back then.
It was. And a lot of that, it's an interesting point to look at it when we're called to rise up where we're at. And sometimes we may find ourselves in slavery, sometimes we may find ourselves in freedom. But wherever we choose to be, let God deal with the big issues. We deal with who we are in that moment. I think similar passages, this is really centered around looking at authority, recognizing authority as being from God. And even when it's being misused and perverted, we still honor what God has placed there, even though we may not agree with the person. It doesn't mean you do evil things. It means you do what's right, but nonetheless, you rise up underneath an evil person and point to the truth.
I think a part of this is understanding this quote here, is understanding light is only good in darkness. And when you've got a hard master over you, you cannot change that, but you can do the best thing with what you have. You trust the Lord and you do the best. Light only shines when you're called to do it. And if you're doing right and somebody's mistreating you, everybody sees that. If you've got somebody that's over the top, everybody sees the way you're being treated and how you're going to respond to it. It goes back to the competition. If you're trying to only do when somebody's looking, you never win. But if you do what's right, you learn to sleep better at night rather than worrying about it. If you're always trying to get ahead of somebody, you got to be right with the Lord instead of with people.
Yeah, but things don't change unless you fight back. I mean, look at Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mandela. They weren't submissive.
Well, so you have lots of examples, like Martin Luther King versus someone like, who's the head of the Black Panthers? Malcolm X, yeah. You have quite different contrasts. One who, at least the way from the little I've read, one who respected authority, one who did not.
But it still took courage on part of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mandela to step up and say, I'm going to take your blows, but I'm going to get up again, I'm going to keep coming at you.
Yeah, and I think but that's essentially.
But it's not being submissive. That's getting.
Well,
I don't know about that.
There's a difference. I think that a great example that I like to point to is John the Baptist. John the Baptist was this somewhat, we would consider rather strange person coming out of the desert, oddly dressed. He was a prophet of God. He's predicted in the Old Testament. And, he did take Herod to task and ended up losing his head for it. He did not try to put himself in the position of a revolutionary, starting a revolution. But he did confront Herod, who was far, far above his authority, and said, what you're doing is wrong with, this woman who's you're not married to. And you're familiar with the story. And Jesus Christ, even when he was actually before the Sanhedrin, he was not what we would call he was not a pushover. I mean, he did, quote unquote, in a respectful but truthful way, talk back. He did tell the truth. it is possible for an employee or a slave, depending on the relationship, to, if he's set a good example, perhaps, to be able to talk to the person over him and say, you know, it might be to your advantage to do this, as opposed to saying, I'm not going to do this anymore and I'm out of here. You know what I'm saying? There is a way of communicating to authority, and we have dealt, and we're going to continue to deal with this in the men and women's roles things. There is a way to deal respectfully with authority. Like, who was that woman we talked about? The one with David. Abigail.
Oh, Abigail,
Yeah, Abigail. That whole thing was an example of this. Of someone, very shrewdly addressing authority and actually getting them to change their path and the way they're doing things. But, she didn't come after David with her army of her own. Sometimes you're not in the position to do a power play. But you can still influence the way
Don't you
people
think
think.
sometimes you just gotta do it, like John the Baptist and Jesus? Even if you're not gonna win,
Well,
you just gotta do it, which is not submissive.
Well, I guess we need to just differentiate. We're not talking submission. We're talking about respect for authority. So, for example, if someone comes to you and says, "Your boss," let's say you're whoever's over you, your boss, your slave owner, whatever, it comes to you and says, "I want you to go clean the front of that store, and then when the owner's not watching, I want you to steal this out of the cash register and bring it to me." And you go and say, "Well, I'm sorry, I will not steal, that's not right," but you still go and clean the front of the store. I mean, you are respectful of authority, you're responding, you're doing work, you're continuing to serve your master until it comes to a point where it's wrong, and then you're standing up and saying, "I can't do that." You don't say and says, "What are you, an idiot?" You don't say that. You simply say, "I can't do that, that's wrong." And you stand up for right, which is similar to what many of the leaders that we've seen stand up. They're often doing it in a very respectful way, not always, but they differentiate between what is right and what is wrong. And submission, in this context, is talking about the authority. Like, for example, I can't go and tell Obama and say he's an idiot and say bad things about him. It would be wrong of me and sinful. However, I can argue if he does something that's incorrect or wrong, I can point that out, but I do it in a respectful way. Similar with other leaders, similar with other masters, similar with other bosses. And I think the idea of submission isn't saying, "Yes, I'm going to do whatever you tell me to do." It's saying, "I will do whatever you tell me under your authority. It's right because I respect your authority. But if you break the right of your authority and do something that's wrong, I can't follow that. And I will stand up and I will speak to that. But I'll do it respectfully." That's the submission part, not the point of saying, "I'm just going to do everything you tell me." That's a passive submission. We're talking an active submission. I guess, yes.
Verse 23 kind of sums it up. It's talking about Jesus. It says, "When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly."
Why don't we pick up here next week?
Yeah.
We're out of time, but we should probably talk a little more about it. I think we could.
Yeah, we should.
So,
Close with a quick prayer, Chris.
sure. Let's pray. Holy Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for giving us direction, giving us your spirit. Lord, I ask that you would continue to help us work through the questions that we have, that your light may be the guiding source for us, that you may bring us into a truthful understanding, that we may live out our days in a way that shares your light with those around us and that completes your work in us. Lord, I thank you for this morning. In your Son Jesus I ask. Amen.